Victorian parenting was a strange blend of strict rules, cold manners, bizarre medical beliefs, and a deep obsession with order that would probably get most parents arrested, canceled, or at least seriously questioned today. And if you were a child in Victorian England, you would quickly learn that childhood was not considered a magical time of wonder, but more like an early internship, where you were expected to behave like a tiny adult with perfect manners, ironed clothes, and a complete absence of feelings. And the day you were born, the expectations already began because Victorian parents believed that babies should be disciplined almost immediately, sometimes within months, and crying was not viewed as a natural need, but rather as a bad habit to be eliminated as fast as possible. So, mothers were encouraged by popular parenting manuals to ignore crying babies completely because picking them up would spoil their character. And so countless infants were left alone in dark, cold nurseries until they learned that silence was safer than seeking comfort. And the idea of gently holding a baby to soothe them would be seen as dangerous softness. So if you ever time traveled with your modern parenting knowledge, Victorians would accuse you of raising a future criminal simply because you rocked a baby to sleep. Of course, this coldness continued as children got older, and most Victorian parents believed that affection ruined discipline, so they rarely hugged their children, and many kept a formal distance at all times, sometimes even referring to themselves not as mama and papa, but mother and father, spoken in the tone you'd use to address a strict judge, and children were expected to obey instantly without questions, suggestions, or emotional negotiations. Because the idea of a child talking back was considered a sign of moral decay. And if you think timeouts today are harsh, Victorian discipline involved canes, leather straps, slipper beatings, and even schoolmasters who carried canes with names like the Persuader, all considered completely normal. And parents believed that physical punishment was essential for building character, not because the children did anything terribly wrong, but because Victorians believed that children were born naturally sinful and had to be beaten into goodness, like metal being forged into shape. Daily life was full of rules, so detailed and exhausting that even adults today couldn't keep up, because Victorian society expected children to sit still for long periods, speak only when spoken to, memorize enormous amounts of etiquette, and never show emotions in public. And if a child laughed too loudly, asked a silly question, or wiggled in their chair, it was seen not as childish behavior, but as a potential moral crisis requiring immediate correction. And this is when Victorian parenting manuals truly shined, offering wonderfully terrible advice, like telling parents to break the child's will before the age of 12, which sounds more like instructions for dealing with a disobedient horse than for raising a human child, and even simple mistakes, like spilling tea or dropping a toy, could result in severe punishment because it suggested the child lacked self-control, cleanliness, or moral fiber. But perhaps the most shocking difference between Victorian parenting and modern parenting is how quickly children were expected to grow up and start working, because childhood itself was not considered a special protected stage of life, but a temporary training ground for labor. And by the age of 5 or 6, many children were already spending long days in factories, coal mines, chimney sweeps, shafts, or as servants in wealthy homes, doing jobs that would today violate every labor law ever written. And Victorian parents often encouraged this because children's wages were needed to support the household, and society viewed working children as hardworking and admirable, not exploited. And if you were lucky enough to go to school instead of the factory, the school environment wasn't any softer because teachers were considered second parents, and they carried canes, rulers, and straps with the same sense of duty and enthusiasm. Even free time was controlled with an iron grip, because Victorian parents believed that children should never waste time. So even play had to be educational, moral, calm, and ideally very boring. And toys were often simple objects designed to teach discipline or religious values, not creativity. And running around, yelling, or playing wildly was discouraged because it looked undignified. And let's not forget that Victorian clothing didn't help either, with boys forced into stiff suits and girls squeezed into heavy dresses with layers of petticoats. And the expectation was that children should always look neat and controlled. even if the outfit prevented them from breathing properly or moving more than 2 inches at a time. Victorian parents were also obsessed with morality, always warning their children that misbehavior, curiosity, or even imagination could lead to sin, laziness, or ruin, and they used terrifying stories to enforce obedience. Tales of children being kidnapped, starved, punished by supernatural creatures, or mysteriously dying because they didn't follow the rules. And although today we use gentle bedtime stories to soothe kids to sleep, Victorian bedtime stories were more like psychological warfare designed to produce maximum obedience through fear, always reminding children that danger lurked everywhere. And if the world didn't punish them for misbehavior, then God certainly would. Medical beliefs didn't make things easier either, because Victorian parenting existed in a time before modern science, so children were often treated with remedies that were more dangerous than the conditions they were supposed to cure. And crying babies were sometimes given soothing syrups that contained alcohol, morphine, or opium, which would knock the child out for hours, but obviously came with horrifying health consequences. And teething babies were often given numbing powders containing mercury. And if a child looked stressed or anxious, the recommended treatment might be a cold bath, a lecture on morality, or simply telling them to toughen up, because Victorians didn't believe in discussing emotions or mental health, and children were expected to swallow their feelings along with whatever strange medicine their parents handed them. Privacy for children didn't exist either, because parents believed they needed to monitor everything their children did to prevent misbehavior or sinful thoughts, so diaries were regularly inspected, letters opened, friendships controlled, and sometimes even toys were checked for moral appropriateness. And the idea that a child could have personal boundaries would be seen as ridiculous. So Victorian kids had little emotional space, no freedom to express themselves, and constant supervision, creating a childhood experience that was more like life under a strict government than a warm family home. But even within this harsh system, parenting varied depending on class, because wealthy Victorian families raised their children with an entirely different structure, often handing them over to nannies, governesses, and tutors who acted as the real caregivers, while the parents saw their own children for only brief formal visits, sometimes just an hour a day. And wealthy parents believed that too much affection was dangerous and made children weak, so upper-class kids grew up seeing their parents almost like distant authority figures, while middle and working-class children faced the opposite problem: parents so overwhelmed by poverty and work that affection became a luxury, and survival took priority over emotional needs. Still, despite how strict and cold Victorian parenting seems, many parents truly believed they were doing the right thing, because these methods were considered scientifically supported, morally necessary. And as you drift toward sleep, just imagine yourself in a Victorian nursery. The fire crackling softly, the gas lamps flickering, car seats, supervision, education, and protection. It becomes clear why Victorian parenting would be illegal, condemned, and shocking today. And yet it also reveals how far society has come in understanding children, their needs, and their rights. And as you drift toward sleep, just imagine yourself in a Victorian nursery. The fire crackling softly, the gas lamps flickering, and the distant sound of a governess's footsteps echoing down the hall. Car seats, supervision, education, and protection. It becomes clear why Victorian parenting would be illegal, condemned, and shocking today. And yet it also reveals how far society has come in understanding children, their needs, and their rights. And as you drift toward sleep, just imagine yourself in a Victorian nursery. The fire crackling softly, the gas lamps flickering, and the distant sound of a governess's footsteps echoing down the hall. And feel grateful that you live in a time where children are allowed to cry, laugh, play, express feelings, and simply be children. Because the Victorian world may be fascinating to read about, but it is certainly not a place you'd want to grow up, especially not under the parenting rules that seem more suited to mythical beasts than to tiny humans. And as the lamps dim, the world quiets, and your eyes grow heavy, the strictness of the past slowly melts away. because the Victorian world may be fascinating to read about, but it is certainly not a place you'd want to grow up, especially not under the parenting rules that seem more suited to mythical beasts than to tiny humans. And as the lamps dim, the world quiets, and your eyes grow heavy, the strictness of the past slowly melts away, leaving only the gentle comfort of modern sleep and the soft reminder that history, no matter how strange or harsh, always makes for the best bedtime stories.